The compass came to her wrapped in nothing at all. No velvet box, no ribbon, not even the courtesy of tissue paper. Just her father's hand, and then, after his hand stopped moving forever, a lawyer's hand, passing it across a mahogany desk, as though it were an afterthought, too small to bother wrapping. She would not learn until much later that the corroded brass housing, dented from 40 years in a coat pocket, held inside it the answer to every question the family had spent a decade refusing to ask her. For now, she only knew this: her brothers got the ships. She got the thing that pointed nowhere. The rain over Newport that morning had the particular gray patience of late autumn, the kind that did not fall so much as hang, beating on the black umbrellas gathered at the edge of the family plot. She stood apart from the others, not by design but by old habit, the habit of 11 years spent apart, hands stained with grease and brine, while her half-siblings built their careers in glass towers 40 miles and one whole universe away. She could smell the salvage yard on herself even here, even now, diesel and rust and the low mineral stink of the harbor, and she wondered if her father, in the mahogany box being lowered before her, could smell it too, and whether it had ever meant to him what it meant to her. She had been the one who drove him to his dialysis appointments on Tuesday and Thursday mornings, the one who learned to read his moods by the particular way he held his coffee cup, the one who sat with him in the office trailer at the yard through the last 2 winters, listening to the radiator clank while he talked less and less. Her siblings had sent flowers, once a fruit basket, delivered by courier, with a card that read, "Thinking of you, Dad," in a florist's handwriting, not their own. Now they stood across the grave in their good wool coats, dry-eyed, checking the time. "He'll want us at the reading by 2, her stepbrother said, not lowering his voice, as though the dead did not deserve the courtesy of hushed tones. Punctuality was the one thing he actually respected. She said nothing. She had learned, over 11 years, that silence cost her nothing and gave them nothing to use against her. The priest finished his words. The clods of wet earth made a sound she would remember for the rest of her life, a soft, final percussion, and somewhere behind her someone's phone buzzed, and was silenced, and buzzed again. She looked down at her hands, chapped and calloused, utterly unlike the hands of the people around her, and thought of her father's hands, how they had once closed around hers on a dock at low tide, teaching her to read a compass by feel before she could read a clock. She did not yet know that he had left her, in effect, the only true thing he owned. The rain had thinned to a fine mist by the time the gravediggers began their work in earnest, and she stood a moment longer than the others, watching the machine lower the vault with a mechanical patience that seemed, to her, more honest than any of the eulogies that had preceded it. No one had asked her to speak at the service. She had not expected to be asked. Her stepmother, dressed in a black Chanel suit that had likely cost more than the yard's entire quarterly revenue, had delivered a eulogy about a man who golfed and vacationed in Nantucket, a man Elena did not recognize, a man who bore only a passing resemblance to the one who had spent Christmas mornings elbow-deep in bilge grease because a client's trawler needed to sail by New Year's. She had listened to it the way she listened to weather reports, information that did not apply to her, spoken in a language she understood but no longer trusted. The lawyer's office was 4 blocks from the cemetery, on the 9th floor of a granite building on Thames Street that smelled of lemon polish and old paper, and the family filed into it still damp from the rain, shaking hands they did not mean to shake, arranging themselves in leather chairs with the unhurried entitlement of people who had never once doubted their place in a room. Elena took the seat nearest the door. It was a habit from the yard, always know your exit, and no one seemed to notice, or if they noticed, no one remarked on it, because remarking on Elena had stopped being interesting to them years ago. She had become furniture to them, useful furniture, when there was a boat that needed appraising, or a client who needed placating, but furniture nonetheless. The lawyer, a heavy-set man named Whitfield, with tired eyes and reading glasses that kept sliding down his nose, arranged a folder in front of him with the careful, ceremonial slowness of a man who had done this many times and had never once enjoyed it. Outside the window, gulls wheeled over the harbor, and somewhere below a delivery truck idled, its engine a low, patient hum beneath the room's tense quiet. Her stepbrother checked his watch again, a Patek Philippe their father had given him at his college graduation, and Elena remembered, with the sudden clarity grief sometimes permits, that she had never once been given a gift with her father's money behind it, only his time, his hands, his voice teaching her the difference between magnetic north and true. She had thought, foolishly perhaps, that this was the greater inheritance. She did not yet know how right and how wrong that thought would prove to be. Whitfield cleared his throat, adjusted his glasses, and began to read. "To my son," Whitfield read, his voice pitched at the flat, official register lawyers use to keep grief at arm's length. "The entirety of my shares in Marsh Logistics Holdings, including all voting rights, board positions, and appurtenant properties in New York and Providence." He did not pause for reaction, though there was none needed. The son merely nodded once, as though confirming a delivery he had already tracked online. "To my daughter, here." Whitfield glanced up briefly, and something in his tired eyes softened, though whether from sympathy or simple fatigue at reading the same paragraph structure twice, she could not tell. "The entirety of my remaining liquid assets, held in trust, and the property at Bellevue Avenue." The daughter exhaled, a small, satisfied sound, and reached for her purse as though the reading were already concluding, as though the rest of the room were merely formality to be endured. Whitfield turned a page. The paper made a sound like a held breath releasing. "To my daughter Elena," he read, and something in the room shifted. She felt it before she understood it. A subtle recalibration of attention, the way gulls outside seemed to hush their wheeling for just a moment. "I leave my brass compass, purchased in 1961, and carried by me every day since." He paused. There was no addendum, no further clause, no accompanying trust, no small kindness folded into legal language to soften the blow. Just the compass, just that. The silence that followed had a texture to it, thick and specific, and into that silence her stepbrother laughed, not loudly, not cruelly enough to seem monstrous to a stranger walking past the door, but with the particular, practiced condescension of a man who had spent his whole life being amused by things beneath him. "Well," he said, straightening his cuffs, "at least it's fitting. She gets the only thing in this world worth less than her." Nobody corrected him. Nobody even looked at her. Her stepsister examined her nails. The lawyer removed his glasses entirely, folded them, and set them on the folder, a small gesture of retreat, as if he wanted no part of what his own mouth had just delivered into the room. Elena did not cry. She had trained herself, over 11 years of hauling winches and patching hulls in the cold Newport wind, not to cry in front of people who would enjoy it. She reached forward instead, took the small velvet box Whitfield slid across the table, and felt its familiar weight settle into her palm, lighter than she remembered, and colder. Through the window, the delivery truck below finally pulled away, and its engine noise faded into the ordinary hum of a city continuing, indifferent, into an afternoon that did not know yet what it was carrying. She did not open the box in the office. She did not open it in the elevator, though her stepbrother watched her hands the entire descent as if he expected her to weep into the velvet right there between the polished brass rails, and she understood that this too would have pleased him, proof, delivered in real time, of how thoroughly he had won. She held the box the way she held tools she did not yet trust, fingers loose, weight distributed, giving nothing away. Outside, Boston had gone the color of wet slate, the rain beginning in earnest now, and she walked 6 blocks in it, without an umbrella, because the cold felt like the only honest thing left in the day. She opened it on the train instead, alone in a window seat with her coat still dripping, the city sliding past in gray smears of glass and brick. The compass sat in a nest of yellowed cotton, its brass casing dark with age, one hinge bent slightly inward, the glass face fogged with what she would later learn was 50 years of moisture trapped beneath it. She turned it over in her palm. Her father had carried this exact object in the left pocket of his canvas coat every day she had known him, through winters on the yard when the wind came off the water sharp enough to crack skin, through the long afternoons when he'd stand at the end of the dock watching ships he no longer owned pass toward harbors he no longer controlled. She had assumed, without ever asking, that it was sentiment, a dead man's habit, something a woman raised on boats might romanticize, and a man raised in boardrooms would never bother to. She had not expected to be given it as an insult. The train rocked. Somewhere behind her, two men in suits discussed a quarterly report in low, satisfied voices, and she found herself listening to the rhythm of their certainty, the way she used to listen to engines, for the note that didn't belong. She closed the box. She did not cry then either, though her throat had tightened somewhere around Route 128, and she pressed her forehead briefly to the cold window glass and let the vibration of the rail travel up through her skull until it dulled the noise inside it. By the time she reached the Newport station, the rain had stopped, leaving the platform slick and steaming faintly under the sodium lights. She walked the 1.5 miles to the salvage yard because she did not yet trust herself to drive, past the shuttered bait shop, past the marina gates chained for the season, past the house she had grown up in, now dark, now technically no longer hers to enter without her stepmother's permission. She let herself into the yard office instead, the only key still hers, and set the velvet box on her father's old desk beside the marine radio he'd never once turned off in 11 years. She did not open it again that night. She only sat, in the dark, with her hand resting on the lid, the way she used to sit with him. The office smelled the way it had always smelled, diesel and salt and the particular mustiness of marine charts gone soft with humidity, and for a long while she let that smell do the work grief could not. She did not turn on the overhead light. She sat in the glow of the radio's tuning dial, a small green eye in the dark, and she thought of nothing in particular, which was its own kind of mercy. Morning came gray and unremarkable, the way mornings do when the world has not noticed that anything in yours has ended. She woke stiff in the desk chair, her neck aching, the velvet box still under her palm where she had left it. She made coffee on the hot plate her father had kept for 30 years, the same chipped mug with the faded anchor on its side, and she drank it standing at the window, watching the gulls work the tide line, before she allowed herself to open the box again. The compass looked smaller in daylight, ordinary, a tarnished brass housing no larger than her father's palm, the glass face fogged with age, the needle beneath it frozen at some heading that meant nothing to her yet. She turned it once in her hand. There was a hairline seam running around the base of the housing, and she noticed, the way she noticed a hull plate seated wrong, the way 11 years of patient looking had trained her to notice, that the seam was uneven on one side, thicker, as though the metal there had been worked twice. She set it down. She told herself it was nothing. Brass warped with age. That was simple chemistry, not mystery. But she did not put it away. The days that followed unspooled with a kind of merciless ordinariness. The yard's accounts, she learned from a call she had not wanted to make, were to be settled within 90 days. Her stepmother's attorney used the word settled, the way one might use it about a debt, not a life, and the equipment, the cranes, the 2 remaining haul trucks, were to be appraised for sale. She kept working, because the work did not know her father was dead. The winches still needed grease. The bilge pumps still needed testing before the last boats came out of the water for the season. She moved through these tasks with her hands doing what they had always done, competent and unthinking, while some other part of her sat very still, waiting for a feeling that had not yet arrived in full. At night she came back to the office and to the compass, turning it under the desk lamp, running her thumbnail along that uneven seam until the metal warmed faintly from her own persistence. It was on the 9th night, half by accident, that her thumbnail caught the seam wrong and the housing shifted, barely, a hair's width, like something that had been sealed once and was never meant to open again by ordinary hands. She did not force it further that night. She set the compass down on the desk blotter, the way one might set down something that had just proven itself alive, and she sat there a long moment listening to the building settle around her, the tin roof contracting in the cooling air, a gull somewhere out past the breakwater, the low mechanical hum of the bait freezer that never fully shut off. Her father had kept that freezer running for 11 years past its usefulness, the same way he kept everything. Not out of sentiment, she had always assumed, but out of a stubborn refusal to admit that anything under his care could be finished. She had inherited that stubbornness, if nothing else. She did not touch the housing again for 3 days. Instead, she cleaned it as she would have cleaned any piece of bright work brought in off a boat: a soft brass brush, a cotton rag, a dab of oil worked into the hinge pin with the corner of a toothpick. Patient work, work with no urgency in it, the kind of work her siblings had never once had the stillness to sit through. She had watched them, growing up, lose interest in anything that did not resolve within the hour. Her stepbrother in particular had the attention span of a man perpetually checking his watch, which was, she thought without pleasure, an accurate description of the man he had become. On the third night, she noticed something she had missed before, distracted as she'd been by the seam itself, a hairline groove circling the underside of the housing, so fine it caught the desk lamp only at a certain angle, like a scar healed almost invisible. She tilted the compass, and the light slid along it, and she understood, with the particular quiet of a fact arriving without fanfare, that this groove had not been cut by the original manufacturer. It was newer, cleaner, the kind of cut a jeweler's saw made, or a machinist's, decades after the compass itself had left whatever factory had stamped its face. Someone had opened this compass once already, and closed it again, and wanted it closed well. She thought of her father's hands, thick-knuckled, always faintly stained with engine grease, no soap ever fully lifted, and tried to imagine those hands doing precision work like this, and could not. Which meant someone else had done it, which meant her father had gone to someone else, deliberately, quietly, and asked them to hide something inside a compass he then carried in his coat pocket for years, through every haul-out and every winter, until the day he died. She sat with that thought until the freezer cycled off and the room went, briefly, entirely silent. Then she picked up the toothpick again and began, very carefully, to work the seam a second time. The seam gave differently this time, not the reluctant grind of metal unused to motion, but something looser, almost cooperative, as though the compass itself had been waiting 11 years for someone patient enough to ask twice. She did not force it. She had learned that much in the salvage yard, watching men twice her size ruin good fittings because they mistook strength for skill. Force was for people who did not understand what they were holding. She understood, now, that she was holding something that had been made to look ordinary on purpose. The housing separated with a small, dry click, like a knuckle settling, and beneath the brass plate, beneath the compass rose she had stared at 1,000 times as a child, tracing the painted N with her fingertip, while her father steered by feel through fog he claimed he could taste. There was a second surface, a false floor, machined flat and fitted so precisely that without the raking light of the workshop lamp she never would have seen the hairline border of it at all. She did not breathe for a moment. Then she noticed she had not breathed, and made herself do it, slowly, the way she'd once taught herself to slow her pulse checking a compression gauge on a running engine. Beneath the false floor lay a disc of oiled paper, folded into quarters, brittle at its creases the way paper gets when it has been folded once and never touched again. Beside it, stamped into the metal itself, in characters too small for anything but a jeweler's loop, or very good eyes, a manufacturer's mark she did not recognize, and beneath that, a string of numbers that looked less like a serial code and more like a registry, the kind stenciled on the bow plates of old cargo hulls, numbers she had seen 100 times chalked on manifests in her father's crabbed handwriting. She set the paper down on the workbench without unfolding it. Her hands, she noticed, were not steady, though her mind felt strangely clear, the way the yard went clear and quiet after a storm passed through and left the docks smelling of salt and ozone and relief. Her father had not simply carried a compass, he had carried a door. She thought of the lawyer's office, the smell of lemon polish and old leather, her stepbrother's voice saying the only thing in this world worth less than her, and she almost laughed, not from humor, but from the strange vertigo of realizing how completely he had misjudged the object in her hand, how thoroughly her father had planned for exactly that kind of contempt to be the last word spoken over this compass before anyone thought to look inside it. She reached for the paper again, and this time she began, carefully, to unfold it. The paper resisted her at the first crease, stiff with decades of oil and salt worked into its fibers, and she understood, unfolding it, that it had been folded this way for so long the creases had become part of its shape, the way a scar becomes part of a hand. It was not a single sheet, it was three, pressed together, the outer one brittle as a dead leaf, the inner two softer, protected. She laid them flat under the workbench light, weighting the corners with a socket wrench and a jar of brass screws, and bent close enough that her breath disturbed the paper's edge. The first sheet was a bill of sale. She read the date twice before she believed it. 11 years old, nearly to the month, dated the same spring she had come home from the community college, with a 2-year certificate in small engine repair, and her father's silence at the dinner table, the silence she had mistaken, all these years, for disappointment. The vessel named was a cargo hull, decommissioned, sold not to a shipping concern or a scrapper, but to a private buyer whose name she did not recognize, listed at an address in Providence she did recognize, a stretch of waterfront near the old rail spur, the kind of place where the harbor gave up pretending to be picturesque. The second sheet was a hand-drawn schematic, her father's draftsman's lettering unmistakable, even faded, showing a compartment behind a bulkhead, dimensions noted in his careful fractions, a small arrow and the words, below waterline, aft of #3 hold. The third sheet had no drawing at all. It was a letter, and at the top of it, in ink that had browned but not blurred, was her name. She did not read it yet. She found she couldn't. She set it down as if it might scald her, and stood with both palms flat on the workbench, listening to the halyards ticking against the masts outside, the gulls arguing over something down by the fuel dock, the ordinary evening sounds of a yard that had no idea what had just changed inside it. 11 years she had scraped hulls and rebuilt bilge pumps and told herself that patience was its own kind of inheritance. 11 years her father had let her believe that. And the whole time 3 folded sheets of paper had been waiting inside a housing he had welded shut with his own hands, in a workshop not 40 feet from where she now stood, trusting. She understood this now, with a certainty that felt almost physical, that if anyone in the family would ever think to open a worthless compass instead of simply pawning it, it would be her. She picked the letter back up. This time her hands had gone steady. The paper had been folded 3 times, and the creases had gone soft and gray with age, the way cloth goes after 100 washings. She unfolded it under the workbench lamp, careful as a conservator, because some old habit in her hand refused to treat any paper carelessly, no matter what it might say. The salt air had gotten to it a little, along the top edge, but the ink itself had survived. A fountain pen, blue-black, the handwriting unmistakably his, small, upright letters, the same hand that had written invoices for 40 years, that had signed her school report cards when no one else would. "If you are reading this," it began, "then you did the one thing I always believed you would do, and never told you I believed, because I did not want you to do it for me. I wanted you to do it because it was in you." She had to stop there. She looked up at the ceiling, at the water stain shaped like a country she had never been able to name, and made herself breathe before she went back to the page. He wrote about the yard first, not sentimentally, but practically, the way he'd always talked, as though love and inventory were the same language to him. He wrote about a vessel, the Meridian Star, decommissioned 11 years ago, sold on paper to a shell holding company he had quietly kept controlling interest in, moored now, he believed, as of the letter's writing, in a scrapyard outside Providence, waiting on a demolition permit that had been delayed, and delayed again, for reasons he did not explain but underlined twice. Do not let them scrap her before you look. He had written, look in the aft hold, look under the floor plates. You will know what you are looking for when your hands find it. There was no mention of sapphires, no mention of money at all, not directly, only that phrase, worn smooth with repetition in her mind already. You will know. He had trusted her hands the way he had never quite trusted his own voice to say the things a father was supposed to say. It was, she thought, exactly like him, to leave love folded inside a task, the way he'd once taught her to find a slow leak not by looking, but by listening, by resting a palm flat against cold metal until it told you where it was hurting. The last line was shorter than the rest, written in a hand that looked, for the first time in the whole letter, unsteady. I could not protect you from your brother and sister. I could only make sure you would be the one who understood, in the end, what was actually worth protecting. She folded the letter back along its old creases, slid it into her coat, and went to find a map of Providence. The scrapyard sat behind a chain-link fence that had rusted the same color as everything it enclosed, on a spit of land where the Providence River widened and grew tired of itself, choked with silt and the ghosts of industry. She had called ahead, given a name, listened to a long silence on the other end of the line, before a man with a voice like gravel in a cement mixer told her the vessel she was asking about had been sitting there so long the harbor authority had stopped billing for it. Nobody wanted it, he said. Nobody had wanted it in 11 years. She parked on the gravel apron at 9 in the morning, the sky the color of dishwater, and walked past hulls stripped down to their ribs like carcasses picked over by something patient. The ship, when she found it, was smaller than she'd imagined. A converted freighter, maybe 200 feet, her name long since sanded from the bow, though Elena could make out the ghost of letters beneath a skin of orange rust if she tilted her head at the right angle in the flat light. Marguerite. Her mother's name. She stood at the base of the gangway for a long moment before she made herself climb it. The deck groaned under her boots, gulls scattered from the wheelhouse windows, their voices sharp and accusing. Everything smelled of salt and diesel gone stale, of wet iron and something underneath that, mildew maybe, or simply time. She had brought a flashlight, a crowbar, a canvas bag with tools she'd chosen the way she used to choose them for a repair job she couldn't yet see the shape of. Her father's voice was in her again, low and certain. You will know it when your hands find it. The aft hold was reached by a ladder bolted to the bulkhead, rungs slick with condensation, and she went down slowly, counting them without meaning to, the way she counted things when she was afraid and didn't want to admit it. At the bottom, darkness pooled thick enough to touch. Her flashlight found floor plates bolted in a pattern that didn't quite match the rest of the hold. Slightly newer bolts, she noticed, the metal a shade brighter where it hadn't yet surrendered to the water. She knelt. She rested her palm flat against the plating, the way he'd taught her, listening for what a surface wanted to tell her before she ever lifted a tool to it. The steel was cold, and beneath the cold there was something else, a hollowness, faint but unmistakable, the sound a thing makes when it is not what it pretends to be. She reached for the crowbar. The bolts had been set with a hand that wanted them found, not hidden. She understood that now, the way she understood the difference between a boat that had sunk and a boat that had been sent down. A man who wished to bury something forever did not leave newer bolts brighter than the old. He left a seam. He left a door with its hinges oiled and its purpose disguised only well enough to keep out a stranger, never a daughter who had spent 11 years learning the particular grammar of his hands. The crowbar found purchase on the third bolt. It gave with a groan that seemed to travel up through her arms and settle somewhere behind her ribs, a sound too loud in a space built to hold silence for decades. She worked the plate slowly, the way he'd taught her to work anything old, not with force, but with patience, coaxing rather than commanding, because force broke things and patience opened them. Rust flaked into her palm like dried blood. Somewhere above her, water moved against the hull with a low, patient percussion, as if the ship itself were breathing, waiting to see what she'd do next. The plate lifted an inch, then two. The smell that rose from beneath it was not the smell of bilge water or diesel, or the rot she had grown used to breathing through her mouth to avoid tasting. It was drier than that, paper and oil, and something faintly metallic, like the inside of a bank vault, like the inside of the safe her father had kept in the salvage yard office that she had never once seen him open. She set the crowbar down and used her fingers instead, because some things deserved to be touched rather than pried, and because she found, kneeling there in the dark with her knees soaked through, and her flashlight beam trembling slightly against the plating, that her hands had begun to shake in a way that had nothing to do with cold. Beneath the plate was a compartment no larger than a steamer trunk, welded seams at its corners, and inside it, wrapped in oilcloth that had gone stiff and brittle with age, the unmistakable shape of a strongbox, and beside it, flat and bound in a canvas sleeve, something that could only be a ledger. She did not touch either yet. She knelt there a long moment, flashlight beam steady now, breath shallow, and let herself understand what she was looking at before she let herself want it. Her father had not simply hidden a fortune. He had built a door only she would know how to open, in a hull only she would know to search, using a language of bolts and welds that he had spent 11 years teaching her to read without either of them ever calling it that. She reached for the strongbox first. The latch had rusted into a single dark seam, and she worked it the way she worked every stubborn fitting on that dock, not with force, but with patience, a drop of penetrating oil from the small tin she still carried in her jacket pocket, out of 11 years of habit, and then a wait. She had learned long ago that metal, like grief, could not be rushed open. It had to be persuaded. She counted 60 seconds in her head, then 60 more. The flashlight propped against the compartment wall so both her hands were free, and when she finally pressed her thumb to the latch it gave, with a small, tired groan, as though something inside had been holding its breath for a very long time. The strongbox lid rose an inch and stopped, swollen with damp, and she had to work her fingers into the gap and coax it the rest of the way. What she found inside did not glitter the way she had, somewhere in the unguarded part of her mind, expected it to. The stones were small, dull, and packed in cotton wadding gone the color of weak tea, dozens of them, uncut, secretive, the kind of thing that revealed nothing to an untrained eye and everything to a jeweler's lope. She did not know gemstones. She knew engines and hulls and the particular ache of 30 years of maintenance logs. But she knew enough to understand that a man who tracked every bolt and gasket in a failing salvage yard would not have wrapped worthless glass in cotton and welded it into a decommissioned hull. She set the strongbox aside, gently, the way she might set down something sleeping, and reached for the ledger. The canvas sleeve had gone stiff with salt air, and it cracked slightly as she peeled it back, releasing a smell of mildew and old ink that seemed to rise up out of decades rather than years. The cover beneath was plain, government issue, the kind of ledger book any shipping clerk might have used for cargo manifests. But when she opened it, the handwriting was unmistakably her father's. That same cramped, forward-leaning script she had watched slant across 1,000 work orders, and beneath it, in a second, more careful hand, columns of figures that did not belong to any manifest she recognized, dates, names she knew far too well, numbers that climbed, quietly, over years, in amounts too precise to be anything but deliberate. She did not understand yet what she was reading. She understood only that her father had not written it for cargo, and not for himself. He had written it for whoever finally found the hull. She closed the ledger, pressed her palm flat against its cover as though she could keep the truth inside a moment longer, and became aware, distantly, that somewhere above her, the rain had started again, drumming softly against the rusted plating like something patient, waiting to see what she would do next. She sat with the ledger for a long while before she trusted herself to open it again, the way one waits after touching something hot, testing whether the burn will deepen or fade. The rain thickened overhead, finding its way through some seam in the hull she could not see, and a thin trickle began to run down the bulkhead behind her, silver in the beam of her flashlight. She did not move away from it. She had learned, in 11 years of crawling through condemned engine rooms and flooded bilges, that discomfort was simply the price of staying long enough to understand something. She opened the ledger flat across her knees and began again from the first page, slower this time, forcing herself to read it the way she would read a hull's corrosion pattern, not for the story it wanted to tell, but for the story it could not help revealing. The dates ran in 3-month intervals, disciplined as a heartbeat, starting 11 years back. 11 years. She did the arithmetic without wanting to, and felt something cold settle low in her chest. 11 years was exactly as long as she had run the yard. Exactly as long as her father had let the company believe the yard was bleeding money on its own, an old man's stubborn charity project, hemorrhaging capital for no reason anyone upstairs cared to examine too closely. She had believed that too, once. She had believed it on the nights she'd paid the crew out of her own account, and told herself it was temporary. The names in the second column were not vendors. She recognized 2 of them from board memos she'd been copied on for years without reading closely, the kind of names attached to titles like Executive Vice President and Director of Logistics, names that, when spoken aloud at holiday dinners, arrived already varnished with achievement. Beside each name, a running total, updated quarterly, climbing without a single dip in 11 years of otherwise volatile shipping markets. No business breathed that evenly. Only theft did. She thought of the mahogany office where the will had been read, the lawyer's dry voice, her stepbrother's laughter cutting the air like a blade dragged too fast across a whetstone. She thought of the compass on the desk, its housing seamed shut with a hand that had not trusted paper alone to keep a secret. Her father had not been careless with money. He had simply stopped trusting the people who were supposed to guard it, and had built, instead, a second set of eyes he could leave behind. She closed the ledger and looked up through the hole in the hull, where the rain fell straight down now in silver threads, lit faintly by the work light she'd wedged into the plating above. Somewhere beyond the rust and the water, and the smell of 40 years of cargo, the city went on believing what it had always believed about her family. She pressed her thumb against the ledger's spine, feeling the old glue crack faintly beneath the leather, and understood, with a clarity that felt almost physical, that she was no longer looking for a fortune. She was looking for proof. She turned the pages back to the beginning, because proof, she had learned in 11 years of reading manifests no one else wanted to read, was never in the middle of a document. It was in the seams. It was in the place where a hand had grown tired, or careless, or afraid, and had written something slightly different from what came before. The first third of the ledger was ordinary: fuel costs, port fees, a column of numbers in her father's blunt, forward-leaning hand, the same hand that had signed her school permission slips and her mother's death certificate. She recognized the pressure of his pen even in numerals, the way the 7 always curled back on itself, like a question he refused to finish asking. Then, 11 pages in, the hand changed. Not dramatically. He had not tried to disguise it because he had never expected anyone but himself to look this closely, but enough that she felt it before she understood it, the way she could feel a hairline crack in a hull plate before her eyes found the seam. The entries after that point were dated, but never itemized. A dollar figure, a route number, a set of initials that meant nothing to her yet, no cargo listed, no manifest number cross-referenced. In a business where every crate, every drum of ballast, every gallon of diesel had a paper trail thick enough to choke a filing cabinet, these lines were conspicuously, deliberately clean. She thought of her stepbrother's voice in the mahogany office, bright and careless as a man discussing weather. The only thing in this world worth less than her. She thought of the compass now sitting wrapped in a cloth in her coat pocket, its brass warm from her own body heat, and understood that her father had known exactly what he was leaving behind when he sealed that housing. Not an insult, but an instruction, addressed only to the one child who had ever cared enough to open something instead of discarding it. The rain thickened. Somewhere above her, a gull screamed once and did not scream again. She held the work light closer to the page and copied the initials into her notebook, careful, unhurried, the way she had once copied the serial numbers off failing bilge pumps before ordering the parts to save them. Habit, she thought, just habit. But her hand was not steady, and she let herself notice that, the way she let herself notice the cold now settling into her knees from crouching too long on steel. She did not yet know whose initials these were. She only knew that somewhere, in a glass tower 40 miles north, someone had signed something they believed no one would ever read again, and that her father, in his last quiet act of distrust, had made sure that someone was wrong. She closed the notebook but did not move. The scrapyard had gone the particular gray of late afternoon in November, when the light stops pretending it will last much longer, and the hull above her ticked and settled as the rain found its way through 100 small failures in the steel. She had spent 11 years listening to vessels speak this language. The groan of metal cooling, the hollow drum of water finding a low point, and she trusted it more than she trusted most people who used their mouths. The ship was telling her it was old and tired, and that whatever it had been asked to keep secret, it had kept for a long time without complaint. She thought of the lawyer's office again, the smell of paper and lemon polish, the way her stepbrother had barely glanced at the compass before calling it what he called it. She had not corrected him then. She did not feel any urge to correct him now. Some corrections were better delivered slowly, with documentation, in a room where no one could interrupt. She photographed the plate before she touched it further, 3 angles, then a 4th for the shadow the low light threw across the stamped numbers, a habit from insurance claims she'd filed for the yard when a client tried to say a part had failed on its own instead of under abuse. Evidence outlived memory. Her father had taught her that without ever using the word evidence, he had simply never thrown away a receipt, a manifest, a scrap of paper with a number on it, in 30 years of running boats in and out of that harbor. She understood now that this had not been carelessness or hoarding. It had been preparation. The initials meant nothing to her yet. 2 capital letters and a 3rd, smaller, tucked beneath like a signature rushed at the end of a long day. But she recognized the type of hand. She had grown up watching her father sign delivery logs in that same clipped, economical script, the kind taught in schools that no longer existed, the kind that valued speed over legibility, because time, in his world, had always been money. This was not her father's hand. It was someone else's, someone who had learned to write the way men like her father had, in rooms she had never been allowed into. She looked up at the hull rising over her, patched and rust-streaked, waiting the way old things wait, without hope, without despair, simply present. Somewhere inside it, she suspected there was more than a plate and a set of initials. She folded the cloth back over the compass, tucked it against her chest, and began, carefully, to look for the door that would let her go deeper. The hull did not want to be entered. She found that out within the first 10 minutes, moving along the waterline with her palm against the metal, feeling for the seam of a hatch beneath decades of rust bloom and gull droppings, and the salt crust that formed on abandoned steel, the way frost forms on a window left too long unwatched. She had brought a crowbar and a headlamp and a thermos of coffee gone lukewarm in the October air, and she used all 3 before she found what she was looking for, a service hatch on the port side, half hidden behind a collapsed davit, its bolts seized with rust the color of dried blood. She worked the crowbar into the gap and leaned her whole weight against it, and for a long moment nothing happened, the hatch holding its silence the way the compass had held its silence for 11 years, refusing to yield anything to anyone who had not earned it through patience alone. She thought briefly of her stepbrother's voice in the lawyer's office, the particular curl of his mouth when he'd called this inheritance an insult. She did not think of him with anger anymore. She thought of him the way she thought of weather, something to be endured, not answered. The hatch gave with a shriek that startled a cormorant off the railing above her, and she stepped back, coughing at the dust that rose from inside like breath escaping a held lung. The compartment beyond was small, low-ceilinged, meant for storage rather than habitation, and the beam of her headlamp found first a stack of oil drums, empty, then a coil of chain gone orange with rust, then, set apart from all of it, on a shelf built into the bulkhead as though it had been placed there deliberately and recently, a metal case, the kind used for surveying equipment, latched shut and unmarked. She did not open it right away. She had learned, in the months since the funeral, that some things asked to be approached slowly, the way her father had approached every repair worth making, not rushing toward the reveal but circling it first, checking for the trap before the treasure. She crouched beside the case and ran her fingers along its edges, feeling for tampering, for false weight, for anything that might explain why a man who owned nothing by the time he died had gone to such trouble to hide something in a ship no one remembered he owned. The latches were cold under her fingers. Somewhere above her, the cormorant returned to its railing, and the yard settled into the particular quiet of late afternoon, the light going gold and then gray. She took a breath and did not yet let it go. The latches gave with less resistance than she expected, 2 small clicks that sounded enormous in the hollowed silence of the hull, and for a moment she let her hands rest flat against the lid without lifting it, as though the case might still change its mind. She thought of her father's hands doing this same motion, patient, unhurried, the same callous thumbs that had taught her to feel for a stripped thread before forcing a bolt. She had spent 11 years learning that lesson in 100 small repairs, never once suspecting it was being taught to her for this. She lifted the lid. Inside, nested in gray foam that had gone brittle with age, were rows of small velvet pouches, drawstring, the kind jewelers used, and beneath them, wedged along the bottom edge, a logbook bound in oilcloth, its pages swollen with old damp and something else, the particular density of paper that has been written on for years by the same steady hand. She did not touch the pouches first. She went to the book, because the book, she understood immediately, was the part of this her father had meant for her to find before anything else. He had never cared much for money. He had cared obsessively about being believed. The first pages were dated 11 years back, in the exact month she had left college to run the yard. The handwriting was his, cramped, slanted, economical, the same hand that had signed her report cards and her mother's death certificate and every invoice the yard had ever sent out. She read 3 lines before she had to stop and press her palm against the cold steel wall of the hull, because her breath had gone somewhere she couldn't find it. Above her, faintly, she heard gulls arguing over something on the dock, and the tide easing against the hull's dead ribs, sounds so ordinary they made the moment stranger, as though the world outside this rusted shell had no idea what was happening inside it. She thought distantly that she should call someone, the lawyer maybe, or no one at all, but she did not move yet. She turned the page instead. The entries were not a diary. They were figures, dates, amounts, initials she recognized instantly and did not want to, transfers. Discrepancies noted in the margins in a hand that grew angrier, tighter, over the years, though the anger never once spilled into the ledger's careful arithmetic. He had known for years, and said nothing, and kept working, kept the yard alive on nothing, while somewhere above him, in glass towers she had never once been invited into, money had been moving in directions it was never supposed to go. She closed the book gently, the way one closes a door on a sick room, and reached at last for the velvet pouches, her fingers steadier now than they had any right to be. The first one was heavier than its size suggested. She loosened the drawstring, and something inside caught the last of the gray daylight coming down through the hatch. Not brightly, not yet, just enough to tell her that the light had found something worth catching. She poured them into her palm the way she had once been taught to check a chain for wear, not grabbing, just letting weight and shape declare themselves. There were 11 stones, rough still, most of them, uncut, the color of something between dusk and deep water, and even in the poor light of the hold she understood she was looking at sapphires, and that she was not equipped, not remotely, to guess what they were worth. She had spent 11 years pricing bilge pumps and second-hand winches. She had no frame of reference for stones that could apparently sit quietly in a dead ship's belly and be worth more than the ship, more than the yard, more perhaps than the fortune she had watched read aloud in a lawyer's office while her name was mentioned once and then set aside. She did not cry. She had expected, if this moment ever came, that she would, some collapse, some release. Instead, she felt something colder and more exact settle into her chest, a kind of clarity she associated with the moment a hull finally gives up the water it has been hiding, when you know, before the pumps confirm it, exactly where the breach is. She poured the stones back into the pouch with care, cinched the drawstring twice, and set it beside the ledger as though the two of them were now, and had always been, a matched pair. The second pouch was lighter, smaller stones, or fewer. She did not open it yet. There would be time. She understood that now, with a strange, unhurried certainty that surprised her more than the sapphires had. Whatever this was, whatever her father had built into the dark of a ship he had told no one he still owned, it had waited for her patiently for years. It could wait another hour while she thought. She sat back against the rusted frame of the old berth, the cold of the metal seeping through her coat, and looked again at the ledger's tight, furious handwriting. He had not been careless. He had not been foolish, or sentimental, or slipping the way she had let herself believe in his last years, when the yard bled money and he waved off every offer of help like a man swatting flies. He had been waiting, building a case in silence, page by page, the way he'd once taught her to trace a slow leak through a hull by following not the water but the rust, back to its first and truest source. Above her, through the hatch, the gulls had gone quiet. The light was failing fast now, the way it does on the water in late autumn, all at once, as if someone had simply closed a hand around it. She would need to climb out soon, but first she reached again for the ledger, turned back to its earliest page, and began, this time, to actually read. The first entry was dated the 3rd week of March, 11 years earlier, the same spring she had come home from the funeral of her mother to find him standing in the driveway with his hands in his pockets, not knowing what to say to her, and had ended up saying nothing at all, only handing her the keys to the yard's old forklift and telling her the starter was going bad again. She had thought, at the time, that the silence between them was grief. Reading now, she understood it had also been the beginning of something else entirely. The handwriting in March was smaller, more careful than it would later become, as though he had not yet let himself feel the anger that would eventually bleed through the ink. He had recorded a transfer, a modest one, $41,000, routed through a Shell subsidiary with a name so blandly corporate it might have been invented by a machine, and beside it, in the margin, a single word underlined twice. Again. She turned the page. April. Another transfer, larger. A note referencing a shipping manifest that did not match the cargo logged at the Baltimore terminal. Then May, and a name she recognized, her stepbrother's, initialed, not spelled out, as if her father could not bring himself to write it in full even in a private book, meant for no eyes but his own. By the 3rd page she understood this was not a record kept in anger. It was a record kept the way he had once taught her to keep the yard's maintenance logs, dispassionately, dated and countersigned, built to survive an argument in a room he would not live to stand in. He had known, even then, 11 years ago, that a day would come when someone would need proof rather than suspicion. He had simply not known it would be her, alone, in the belly of a ship he'd never told her he still owned, reading it by the failing gray light of a hatch he'd also never told her existed. The gulls returned briefly overhead, their cries thin and far off now, swallowed by the wind picking up across the scrapyard. She should go. She knew she should go. The light would be gone within the half hour, and she had left no one on shore who knew exactly where she was. But her hands would not close the ledger. Instead, she found herself doing what she had done 1,000 times over 11 winters in the salvage yard, hunched over some ruined engine block with a headlamp strapped to her forehead long after dark. She kept working, because the thing in front of her was almost finished telling her the truth, and some instinct older than caution told her that stopping now, even for an hour, even for her own safety, would mean losing the thread her father had spent a decade weaving toward her, page by page, transfer by transfer, toward this exact moment, in this exact hull, in her exact hands. So she read on, and the ledger obliged her. The entries were dated with a precision that felt, now, less like bookkeeping and more like testimony, as though he had known, even then, that someone would one day need every column to hold. March of the 9th year. A transfer of $340,000 routed through a shell account bearing a name she almost recognized, a name that belonged to a logistics subsidiary her stepbrother had once bragged about founding himself, at a dinner where he had called it, with a small, self-satisfied laugh, the thing that finally made the old man proud of me. She had believed him. Everyone had believed him. The ledger did not care what anyone had believed. It simply recorded, in her father's cramped, forward-leaning hand, that the subsidiary had never generated $1 of revenue of its own, that every wire into it had come from the parent company's operating accounts, disguised as consulting fees, and that every wire out of it had landed, months later, in personal holdings under her stepbrother's name, and twice, under her half-sister's. The amounts grew as the years went on, small at first, sums that could be explained away as bonuses, as reimbursements, as the ordinary noise of a large company's books. But by the 4th year of entries, the transfers had climbed past 6 figures at a time, and her father had begun annotating them, not with numbers, but with single words in the margin, words that read almost like a private argument he was having with himself, in the only language he trusted. Seen, confirmed. Do not confront. They will bury it deeper. She understood, reading that last note, why he had never gone to the authorities himself. He had been building a case the way she built an engine, piece by piece, with no faith in shortcuts, because a case built too quickly could be dismantled just as quickly by men with better lawyers than the truth. He had wanted something that could not be argued with, numbers that matched, dates that matched, a paper trail that led in only one direction. He had wanted, she realized with a tightness rising in her throat, an air patient enough to finish it. The hatch above her had gone the color of a bruise, dusk settling fast now over the water, and somewhere above deck the wind found a loose plate of steel and worked it back and forth with a low metallic groan that sounded, in the closing dark, almost like a voice trying to finish a sentence it had started years ago. She closed the ledger at last, both hands flat against its cover, and became aware, the way one becomes aware of cold only after it has already settled into the bone, that she was not alone in the hold. She did not move. 11 years of standing over engines that could kill a careless hand had taught her that the first response to danger was never the body. It was the breath, held, and the ears, opened wide as they would go. She heard it now. A second set of footsteps on the ladder rungs above, unhurried, almost lazy, the tread of someone who believed he had already won and had only come to collect the paperwork of his victory. A flashlight beam swept the hold in a slow arc, catching rust and dust motes and, briefly, the whites of her own eyes before she turned her face away from it. "I thought you might come here eventually," her stepbrother said, and his voice in that iron chamber sounded flatter than it had in the lawyer's office, stripped of the marble and the sympathy cards, reduced to what it had always actually been. "Persistent little thing. Father used to say that about you, like it was a compliment." She said nothing. The ledger was still warm from her hands, and she did not let it go. "You should have sold the compass," he said, climbing the last rungs down. His shoes, city shoes, wrong shoes, shoes that had never once stood on a deck, finding uncertain purchase on the metal grating. Some pawn shop in Fall River would have given you $80 for it and you'd have been better off. Instead, you turned it into an archaeological expedition. He said the word archaeological the way he might have said an ugly rash, something distasteful, something beneath him. He hid this ship from you, she said finally, and her own voice surprised her with how steady it came out, how little it shook after everything. 14 years, you never even knew it existed. He hid a lot of things, he said, and for the first time, something in his tone shifted, thinned, became almost careful. That doesn't make them worth finding. The flashlight beam dropped, briefly, to the ledger in her hands, and in the half-second his eyes lingered there, she understood. With the same cold clarity she had once used to trace a hairline crack down the length of a manifold, that he did not yet know what she held. He had come down into the hall afraid of a compass and a rumor, not of numbers, not yet. Above them, the wind found the loose plate again, and it groaned its unfinished sentence into the dark, and neither of them spoke for the length of 3 long breaths, the water somewhere beneath the hull ticking softly against old steel like something patient, keeping time. She did not move the ledger away from him, though every instinct in her body told her to. She had learned, in 11 years of standing over engines that could not be rushed, that the wrong motion at the wrong moment cost more than patience ever did. So she held it where it was, in the cone of his own light, and let him look, because she had already memorized what mattered, the columns, the dates, the small tight handwriting that was not her father's but belonged, unmistakably, to someone who signed invoices with his authority. She had seen enough, he had not. "You should go back up," she said. "The plate on the number 2 deck isn't load-bearing anymore. I wouldn't stand near it twice." He did not go up. He came 1 step closer instead, and the beam swung fully onto the page, and she watched his face do something she had never seen it do in 29 years of watching it from across dinner tables and boardroom photographs and the far side of a mahogany desk in a lawyer's office that smelled of rain. It went still, not shocked. Stillness, in him, was never shock. It was calculation, arriving late. "Those numbers mean nothing without context," he said, and his voice had lost its earlier smoothness, the way a hull loses paint, in patches, unevenly. "You don't know what you're looking at." "I know exactly what I'm looking at," she said. "I've spent 11 years reading manifests nobody else wanted to read. It's the only skill anyone in this family ever thought was beneath them." She closed the ledger, slow, deliberate, the way she had learned to close a housing she did not yet trust the hinge on. "You're going to want to call someone. I'd wait until morning. There's no signal down here, and even if there were, I don't think you'd want to be the one holding a flashlight in a stolen hull when you make that call." Something moved behind his eyes then. Not fear exactly. She would not give it that dignity even in memory, but the first true arithmetic he had done all night, the recognition that the ground he'd been standing on with such ease for 14 years had just tilted a few careful degrees. He reached for the ledger. She stepped back before his hand closed on air, and the motion was so unhurried, so without triumph, that it landed harder than anger would have. "It isn't yours to take," she said. "It was never yours to begin with." The wind found the loose plate a 3rd time, longer now, a low metal note that seemed to come from everywhere in the hull at once, and beneath it, faint, she heard what she would later swear was the creak of the ladder above them, a 3rd weight, somewhere in the dark, shifting its foot onto the 1st rung. Neither of them moved. The beam of her flashlight had gone still against the ledger's spine, and in that stillness the sound repeated itself. Not imagined this time, not the wind's doing, because the wind did not know how to pause between steps the way a foot does when it is deciding whether the rung will hold. Her stepbrother's head turned toward the ladder before hers did. That, too, she would remember. Not his words, not yet. The turn of his head, quick and involuntary, the first honest thing his body had done all night. "Who else knows you're here?" he said, and it was not a question so much as an accusation flung upward into the dark, as if the answer could be shamed into silence. It could not. A second shape descended the ladder rungs with the deliberate care of someone who has climbed in and out of ships' holds for longer than either of them had been alive, and when the flashlight found him at last, she felt something in her chest loosen that she had not known was clenched. The estate lawyer, coat collar turned up against the wet, a manila folder pressed flat beneath one arm, as though he had carried it through the rain, rather than risk it in a bag. He did not look surprised to find them there. That, she understood later, was the whole of it. He had not come by accident. "I telephoned the harbor authority an hour ago," he said, to no one in particular, in the same unhurried courtroom cadence he had used the day he'd read a dead man's will aloud to a room full of people who had already decided what they were owed. "I told them I had reason to believe a vessel under active litigation was being entered without authorization. I did not tell them by whom." His eyes moved from her stepbrother to the ledger in her hands, and something in his expression, not warmth, he was not a man given to warmth, but a kind of grim satisfaction, settled there and did not move. "I imagine they'll want to know that too, before the night is through." Her stepbrother's mouth opened, and for a moment she thought he might try the tone that had always worked on boards and brokers, and men half his age hungry to please him, the tone that assumed the room would bend because it always had. It did not come. What came instead was quieter, almost boyish in its disbelief. "This is my father's ship." "It was," the lawyer said. "For 14 years. It has also been the subject of a scheme your father did not live to see finished." "I don't believe the two facts cancel each other out. I've rarely seen them do so." He said it without cruelty, which somehow made it worse, the way a doctor delivers a diagnosis he has already confirmed twice. Above them, rain found a new angle through the open hatch, and somewhere below the deck plates, water shifted with the tide, patient, indifferent, exactly as it had been shifting for 14 years while 3 people above it decided, at last, who the ship had really belonged to all along. The trial, when it came, was brief and almost quiet, the way large things sometimes are once the weight has already shifted underneath them. There were no cameras outside the courthouse, no reporters angling for the family name, only a gray Tuesday in March, 11 months after the hull had been opened, and a courtroom where the siphoned figures were read aloud in a voice as flat as an actuary's table. 14 years, 11 million, some $100,000, moved through shell invoices and phantom freight charges, all of it traceable now to 2 signatures her father had, in his last years, quietly stopped trusting. She did not attend every session. She did not need to. She had already done her part in a scrapyard, with a rag and a jeweler's loop, in the dark, on her knees, and what came after belonged to lawyers and forensic accountants and men in gray suits who had never once smelled bilge water. Her stepbrother received 4 years. Her half-sister received restitution and a suspended sentence, and a silence at family gatherings that no lawyer could sentence her to, but that fell anyway, permanent as rust. The sapphires, once appraised, catalogued, and released from evidentiary hold, came to her, not as a gift, the estate court was careful to note, but as recovered property, hers by will, hers by blood, hers by the plain fact that she was the only one who had gone looking with clean hands. She sold enough to save the yard. She kept the rest in a velvet roll in the same drawer where the compass had once sat, corroded and dismissed, worth. Her stepbrother's words came back to her sometimes, unbidden, in the particular hour before sleep, less than her. She had the compass restored properly, this time by a man in Newport who specialized in ship's instruments and asked no questions about where the housing's old weld marks had gone. She kept it on her desk at the yard, which she rebuilt slowly, over 3 years, with new pilings and a repainted sign, and a ledger she balanced herself, every month, by hand, the way her father had taught her when she was 9 years old and thought bookkeeping was the dullest thing in the world. Sometimes, in the slow hours before the tide changed, she opened the logbook, her copy of it, the original long since surrendered to the court, and read again the last entry in his hand, the one about the girl who noticed things. She did not need it anymore to prove anything, but she kept it anyway, in the drawer beside the sapphires, because some things are not evidence. They are simply what a man leaves behind when he has run out of time to say it any other way. The yard is still there, the compass still